Good afternoon, evening, everybody. Thank you for braving the heavy rain showers to be here. It's a classic British barbecue, where the likelihood of it raining again is, it's there, but it seems to be holding off for the moment, which we will be grateful for. There's lots of booze, there's lots of food. The part of the reason we're just doing this little kind of panel thing now is to get it out of the way so you can enjoy both the aforementioned things. We're going to entertain you, if that's possible, with European payment regulation. If we've got time, Tom's got a poem that he's written. It's about 400 lines long. No, it's not enough. It's not as bad as the PSD3. On the topic of PSD3, which is what we're going to talk about now. There is a Slido question. There's some QR codes round, and I know Marzana, when she sent the note round, also included it in the link. So if you haven't done the question, please do. We will talk about it in a little bit. I can see the nervous shuffling as people get their phones out. So the plan is that we'll only kind of probably talk for about 20 minutes or so. Mainly talking about, PSD3 and where we're going to go next. You would be pleased to know that which we cover today will be available on our website. There'll be some slides, as there always are, to cover the topics, so don't worry about taking notes. If you've got questions, you can pepper us with them as we go along. When I say us, don't ask me. Tom's the man to ask. But please pipe up as we go along. But I suppose in the virtue of fireside chats, maybe we should sit down, because I'm probably getting my head cut off for the camera. So easy first question, Tom, really. Lots of people here, I'm sure, will have been horribly burnt by their experience of PSD2. Maybe you could just spend a moment before we get into the detail on how PSD3 is, different, an extension of PSD2.
Sure. Within PSD2, as with a lot of European regulation, there was a provision to review how it was working after a number of years. I think it was 5 years. So there was a consultation to see how it was going. The results of that industry and public consultation were generally positive. PSD2 is working quite well, but there were a number of areas where it was considered that some additional work was needed. And those included areas like consumer protection, so additional rights for consumers. Fraud is clearly a subject that everyone is concerned about, so there is a need to improve the anti-fraud aspects. Access to cash, access to payment services, open banking, which was obviously one of the big innovations in PSD2. A bit of a checkered record there, and one of the things about open banking and indeed the rest of the PSD2 regulation is that it hasn't been uniformly applied across the EU, and so there has been forum shopping, so people would go, for example, to Lithuania to get their license, and then they could passport out into other countries. So they go wherever the softest regulator is. So the decision was taken to update PSD2, and in fact what's happened is it's been split into two parts. There is PSD3, but that covers the supervision and regulation of payment institutions, PIs, and it's purely about that side of things, whereas the body of most of the rules that apply to payment service providers and users are now going to be put into a separate instrument, which is called the PSR, Payment Services Regulation. Now, the difference between the directive, PSD2 and PSD3, and the regulation is that a directive is published by the European Union, but has to be transposed into local laws, and there is some flexibility in that transposition exercise, whereas a regulation is published by the EU and it automatically applies equally across all countries, nations. There is no wriggle room there. And so the idea is that by doing things that way, it will harmonise the application of the regulations across the different states.
It will, or it should?
It should. It should. Whether it will remains to be seen.
Cool. So you talked about that splitting up and the role of the regulation versus the directive, all good. In terms of the kind of the things that are going to affect people in this room, we've done a couple of projects looking at PSD3 for some of our clients, hence us talking about it today. But, what are the highlights, the big things that people should be looking out for?
I think a key message is that compared with PSD2, PSD3 is evolution, not revolution. So there were huge amounts of work to be done to prepare for PSD2. That there is not going to be as much work involved to prepare for PSD3. If you are currently regulated under PSD2, you will have to be re-regulated under PSD3. Luckily, there is a grandfathering scheme. So I think from the date that PSD3 comes into effect, you will have 18 months. And there is also a presumption on the local competent authorities that if you are regulated under PSD2, and you can demonstrate that you do meet the additional requirements of PSD3, the presumption is that you will achieve the PSD3. It's almost automatic, not quite, but the presumption is that you will get that. So if you're currently regulated, that's going to be important. Probably it won't impact most of the organisations here, but the e-money regulations are also being rolled into PSD3. So instead of there being separate licensing for e-money issuers, that will also become part of the PI regulation. In terms of impacts more on merchants, I think there will be some changes to SCA. It won't be, as I said, a revolution, but there will be requirements to share additional data, and that data sharing will be mandatory. So I assume that means more data elements that have to be sent in the SCA messages. There are additional requirements to make SCA accessible for users who may be partially sighted or whatever. So there will be changes in that sense. There is going to be additional transaction monitoring required, and so this relates to the fraud requirements I was talking about earlier. So tighter transaction monitoring. Again, probably not too applicable to people here, but card issuers have got a number of additional responsibilities placed on them. They have to take tougher steps against spoofing. That is when a fraudster approaches a customer and says, "This is Barclays Bank calling you. We've noticed some unusual activity on your account. You need to transfer your money from your current this account to a temporary account whilst we sort things out," and suddenly you've transferred all your money into a fraudster. So the issuers are going to have to guard against that and make sure that their customers are educated, know how to recognise their own bank calling them rather than the fraudster calling them. There is an extension of the regulation. At the moment, purely technical service providers don't fall within the scope of the regulation. It is going to be extended. So companies that offer, for example, SCA services to payment service providers, they will have to be regulated, and they will be on the hook for any failures in their services that result in failure of SCA and fraud resulting from that. So that's a good thing to look out for. Make sure that your service providers are aware of that, which I'm sure they will be. there is, again, this is more applicable to issuers. There is a requirement that if you are outsourcing your authentication, then there has to be an outsourcing contract between yourself and the authentication provider. Now, this is going to impact things like Google Pay and Apple Pay, who will say, no, we're not doing the authentication. We're just providing some information to you. It's still the issuer's responsibility. I think that one is going to be a real battleground in the future. And the final one is refund rights. There is a requirement to harmonise card payments with non-card payments, and with direct debits there is a right to an unconditional no questions asked refund up to 8 weeks after the transaction has taken place. And the same thing is going to be applied to merchant initiated card transactions. So if you're a subscription merchant, you need to be really careful, because a customer can come back and say, no, don't want to pay that, and the money goes back to them, and you'll be out of pocket for that. So that is going to be another battleground, I think.
So you saved the best till last
I did. So
in that list. Yeah.
Yes,
Not much is changing apart from this little bit.
Yes.
And I know that spoken to various people, that refund situation is the one that's causing most people most angst. Yeah. And that there's a bunch of merchants who don't accept SEPA direct debits or UK direct debits for exactly that reason, and the right being extended into the card world, particularly for MIT, which has been a relatively untouched part of the SCA universe, will be a pain. Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see if the industry really is pushing quite hard against that element, whether they stick their heels in and say, sorry, we've got to be agnostic, or whether they roll that aspect back. I don't know whether, just pausing on that moment, because I know it is more of an issue for people here. Has anybody got any other questions or views on that refund kind of period? Everybody's still in denial. Yeah, well, trying to avoid it, I think, probably is a good thing to do. And it'll be interesting to see whether issuers promote it as part of the package of services to their customers, or not, or they just kind of keep it quiet. Well, I think the repudiation period is 8 weeks, isn't it? But I don't know the refund period associated with that. Does it go back the 13 months?
I'm not sure about that one. I have to check that.
Back to like a subscription model. Say you use Spotify, and then you don't.
Oh yeah, I think it's not clear.
Not just the 8 weeks.
It's just the 8 weeks, is it? Okay,
it's on a transaction basis, not on a historical basis. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky thing to resolve, and I think part of the reason it was attached to direct debits was because it's difficult to authenticate a customer when you set up a mandate, and therefore there's this extra bit of freedom that's provided in case that mandate was incorrect. But as you say, if the customer's in session and they've provided clear authentication to that mandate, or to the card side of the mandate, does it need to be equitable? And maybe that's the compromise that they'll reach, which says, well, if I do have clear evidence that the customer did authenticate the creation of that continuous authority, then maybe that's okay. But if you shouldn't be setting up MIT with no authentication anyway.
Yes, and that will become mandatory within the new regulation. Yeah. But to be fair, they are also imposing some pain onto users of direct debits, because if you set up an e-mandate, in other words, if the setting up of the direct debit involves your bank, then you have to do strong customer authentication for the setting up of the direct debit mandate as well. That doesn't apply if it's not an e-mandate, i.e. if the customer's bank is not involved in the setup.
So, do you know if the UK is going to be any different with this? Because we are clearly...
We were saving that question to the end.
I was comparing with the direct debit mandate. It's very different, the direct debit mandate.
In Europe, yes.
Lasting gobstopper, as I always call it. But is it likely to be different?
Well, I don't think there will be an expiry date on a direct debit mandate, but in Europe it is more common to have an e-mandate, so that there is an electronic message exchange which involves the customer's bank, and so from now on the customer will have to authenticate and say, yes, this really is me setting up this DD mandate, whereas in the UK it's between the customer and the merchant, and so that doesn't happen.
There's extra burdens for the SDD. Right. But whether the UK, I mean, so just looking at the Slido responses here, most people are just waiting to see what the UK will do and or keeping a close eye on it, but no action. Nobody, luckily, maybe has said that they've completed the review and started the implementation. I think that would be an incredibly aggressive position to take. And surprisingly, few people have been honest and said, sorry, what is PSD3? One of those votes is mine, definitely. I mean, just on touching on that point about where the UK may land, I mean, based on your experience in the payments industry over the last few years, do you think the UK will follow suit to Europe, or...?
It's really difficult to say. I mean, especially in the wake of Brexit, will the UK try and stay aligned with what's happening in mainland Europe, or will we continue to carve our own path and go off in a different direction? I think it is interesting, though, that some of the provisions that the EU is adopting, I think, have been taken from the UK. The UK regulation, if not the experience. So, for example, one of the provisions which I didn't mention is the introduction of what in the UK is called confirmation of payee. So, if you are doing a credit transfer, European banks will have to do a name check on the beneficiary, and if there's a mismatch, then inform the consumer. So that's very much taken from what's happened in the UK. And we were discussing earlier, it hasn't worked particularly well in the UK. There have been a lot of teething problems with it, and trying to implement that across the breadth of Europe, I think, will be an interesting exercise.
So we'll have to wait and see. I'm just conscious of time, and we're keeping everybody from...
Is there any implementation?
There is.
Next question. Excellent. Thank you for teeing us up for that one. Yes.
So the implementation date isn't set in stone. What's happening at the moment is the three parties to the European regulations, the Council, the Commission and the Parliament, are moving into what's called a trilogue, when they all talk amongst themselves and try to come to an agreement. If that is all agreed without any big stumbling blocks, which I think it should be, then probably the legislation will be published in the official journal kind of Q1 of next year. There is an 18-month implementation period for most of the provisions, so that takes us out to sometime in 2026. There will be new regulatory technical standards published to support all of this stuff, and as with PSD2, the most important one will be the RTS covering security, authentication, communications, etc., etc. There are some others around fraud reporting, etc., etc. But
and will it be the EBA that does that again?
It will be the EBA.
Yeah, because I know they tried to duck that role, didn't they, this time, but they don't seem to have managed that.
No, well, they published their RTS and then they spent a huge amount of time publishing clarifications for years and years after that. So yes, I can understand why they didn't want to take that burden on again. But hey, that's their job.
Well, assuming that you have a license. Yeah, well, you're going to have to do as you... Yeah. I think the degree of change that we would anticipate in the UK over the same time horizon will be modest, or is, we have better view of, obviously, it's buy now, pay later, other things that they're looking at. So I don't think we're expecting big changes in the UK. I think in many cases, as Tom said, it's more about actually the continental EU coming a bit closer to where the UK already is, particularly around open banking and confirmation of pay, a couple of other things. So hopefully, if you're already doing it here in the UK, you should be able to extend some of that into continental Europe. But the devil will be in the detail, and it'll depend on what these RTS are going to be, and it'll depend on what Visa and MasterCard do in terms of treatment of the UK, whether they say that the UK needs to follow the same rules and regs as the rest of Europe or not. We'll have to wait and see. So I think it's probably too difficult at this stage to be able to say where we may end up and how different, and whether you can follow a European, an EU standard and apply it in the UK, whether that'd be all right. Strikes me as unlikely, particularly given how the relationships have been over the last few years, that Europe will tolerate a UK set of performance characteristics. One of the interesting things, although fraud is an important part of the document, the massive expansion of APP fraud here in the UK, and how the UK is still grappling with how it deals with that. It hasn't been front of mind in the regulations, and it may be that wave crashes onto Europe before the regulations come in, and it may be that influences the RTS as well. So there's other things also kind of floating around in the background.
So your UK business with some European staff.
I think the relicensing stuff in particular.
Yeah.
It's like it's pain for the sake of it, right? To have to go through, even though you're unlikely to get a no, you're going to have to go back to the regulator and reapply. And that's all right with some regulators, the more competent ones, but the less competent ones, it's going to be a real pig to deal with. And somebody like, the Baltic nations, they granted a lot of licenses that they perhaps don't feel very comfortable with now. They may use it as an opportunity to kind of clean house. And even the Dutch regulator and the Irish regulator have tightened their rules up quite a lot since some of the original PSD2 licenses were granted. So I don't think it's going to be as easy ride as here's an automatic, here's the license. I think they'll use it as an opportunity to tighten the screws a little bit and maybe get rid of some of the licenses that they don't feel comfortable with. Sure, that doesn't apply to anybody here, so it's fine.
A question on another topic. They say that the impact on crypto is going to be gigantic. Is that true or no?
I have absolutely no idea. I think crypto is something that we see on the horizon of payments, but not really affecting day-to-day retail payments. I think it may have an impact on the investment side, but very few of our clients in the payments world have moved crypto into the payments universe as a day-to-day kind of source of fiat.
About the euro becoming eventually a normal currency, and that
yeah, I think the interesting thing, although we have spent some time looking at the digital euro, the heat seems to be coming out from underneath that. And if you look at the way in which the UK is changing its approach to the digital pound and the regulated liability networks and those sorts of things, it seems to be moving away from a central bank owned, public money, new wallets required for everybody. That doesn't seem to be the direction of travel. It seems to be more the kind of smart contracts, those sorts of things, rather than the nature of money itself changing. But I speculate, as we all do. And who knows what the Chinese may do in the meantime. And that seems to have been the thing that motivated people more than tidying up problems with SCA, which is much more near term. So maybe just wrapping up, in terms of what next, we talked about most people are sort of waiting and seeing, a little bit of lobbying, working out what the UK may do, but what should people kind of get on with in the meantime?
There are different drafts of the regulation because Parliament has come up with some proposed amendments and the Commission as well. But a lot of the text is common, so it is well worth going through the text and looking at the areas that you think will impact you. We did do, we have done exercises going through this, and on a per customer basis, looking at which specific provisions are likely to impact that customer, depending on which areas they're operating in, which business areas they're operating in, of course. So on a typical exercise I was looking at, we'd identified 42 different topics which we'd given a RAG status to. Red means you need to get onto this right now, be thinking about your response to it. Amber is, this is probably going to impact you, but take a wait and see approach. And then green means this part of the regulation is almost certainly not going to impact you. So I would start looking at it on that basis, and obviously shameless plug for PSE, we can help you if you would like us to assist you in that process.
So I think it is a sort of, do have a look, don't wait and see too much. Yeah. I think the experience from PSD2 was a lot of people left it very late and didn't take the opportunity to go and have their voice heard at the Commission. I think, things like the refund rights, there are some particular impacts on marketplaces which look a little weird. Spend a little bit of time, find out those red things, work out what you and maybe other people may be interested in, and use the opportunity between now and Q1 next year to influence, to the extent to which that is possible, where things finally land. And if it doesn't necessarily land in your favour, at least you've had a go at it, and it helps internal stakeholders to say, look, we tried, we weren't able to do anything, or indeed we were able to move it, and it may be that continues through the RTS as well. Yeah. So,
are you expecting any questionnaires to come from the regulator here as to how you, like they've done previously and stuff, or is it just going to be up to you to go and intervene?
I think the government probably has bigger things on its plate at the moment for it to worry about. And there's a lot of stuff that's been stored up, even with the FCA. BNPL is a reasonable example, that they know is on their to-do list that they probably want to get rid of first. So I think it's possible that as the noise begins to disappear around the draft, that the FCA will come out and have a consultation document about the extent to which the UK should be proactively aligning with the rest of Europe. I can't imagine that they're rushing to do that. In many ways, because of the uncertainty that we've just discussed, it's not quite clear where it's going to land. Probably. In the FCA, the irony is, of course, that the FCA was always a very proactive part of the European landscape and was one of the much better regulators out there in terms of influencing outcomes from a sensible perspective. That voice is not at the table any longer. So there is a risk that some of these slightly more outre elements of regulation may find their way into the final draft in perhaps a way that they wouldn't have done originally. So difficult to say, but it won't be in the near time, I would guess. It would be a good 18 to 24 months away, I would have thought.